There are some nights when the fog is just fog, and then there are nights when it feels alive. Nights when the road disappears, the woods stretch longer than they should, and the water carries sounds that should not be there. The people in these stories all believed the same thing at first, that what they were seeing had to have a reasonable explanation, until they found the one detail that made that impossible. Welcome to Whispered Horror, where every whisper hides a nightmare. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 terrifying encounters with fog and the things that waited inside it. If you're alone right now, maybe keep a light on, because these stories get darker the deeper you go. The first story happened in Northern California in 2022. At the time, the narrator was living in Oakland and had driven up to Eureka to visit his parents for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's beautiful during the day. At night, it becomes something else entirely. Long, empty stretches, almost no traffic, barely any lights, spotty or non-existent cell service, and a kind of silence that makes you feel like the world has emptied out around you. He left his parents' house around 8 on a Sunday night. He says now that it was a stupid decision. He should have stayed the night and driven back in the morning, but he had an early shift and convinced himself it would be better to just get the drive over with. For the first couple of hours, nothing felt wrong. Then, somewhere near Trinidad, the fog came in. Not gradually, not naturally. It rolled over the road so quickly that within minutes, visibility dropped from clear to almost nothing. He says he could barely see 20 feet ahead of the car, so he slowed down and kept going. He knew he should probably pull over, but on that stretch of highway, there aren't many good places to stop. And more than anything, he just wanted to get home, so he pushed on through it. But anyone who has driven through heavy fog knows what it does to your mind. It steals your sense of space. It erases landmarks. It makes distance feel wrong. It becomes impossible to tell how far you've gone or what might be waiting just ahead. And when you're already tired, it can start to feel almost dreamlike. After maybe half an hour of that, his headlights picked up a shape on the shoulder of the road. At first, it was just that, a shape, a dark figure standing still in the fog. As he got closer, he realized it was a person, a man, judging by the height and build. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't walking. He wasn't even looking around. He was just standing there, facing the road, so still that it didn't even seem natural. The driver slowed down even more as he passed, worried the man might suddenly step into the lane. But he never moved. He didn't lift a hand. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even react to the car going by. The narrator says that was what unsettled him the most. Not the fact that someone was out there in the middle of nowhere, but the way he stood there, as if he had been placed there. Like he wasn't waiting for help. Like he was waiting for something else. He considered turning around. Maybe the guy's car had broken down. Maybe he needed help. But something about it felt deeply wrong. There had been no car on the shoulder, no signs of an accident, no reason for anyone to be standing in that exact place, facing that exact direction. So he kept driving. About 10 minutes later, he saw him again. Same build, same dark clothes, same rigid posture. Only this time, the man was standing on the opposite side of the road. The narrator says he actually spoke out loud in the car. What the hell? Because there was no possible way this guy could have gotten ahead of him. There were no side roads, no visible driveways, no traffic, no explanation. And yet, there he was, exactly the same. This time, as the car passed, the man turned his head sharply and locked eyes with him. That single movement terrified him. It was too sudden, too precise, too aware. He accelerated, trying to put distance between himself and whatever he had just seen. But the fog got worse. So thick now that even the center line was difficult to follow. He had to slow back down. And maybe 3 minutes later, his headlights caught another figure ahead. Only this one wasn't on the shoulder. It was standing in the middle of the road. He had no choice but to stop. The figure wore a hood, hiding its face completely. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react when he flashed his headlights. It just stood there, blocking the lane. He put the car into reverse, and then he looked in the rear-view mirror. There was someone behind him. Another figure, moving slowly toward the back of his car through the fog. That was the moment panic took over. He threw the car back into drive, jerked hard into the opposite lane, and went around the figure in front. For 1 second, he thought he was clear. Then something slammed into the back of his car, violently, hard enough to jolt the whole vehicle sideways, hard enough to make metal scream. He fought the steering wheel, kept the car on the road, and sped forward. And when he finally looked in the mirrors again, there was nothing there. No car, no headlights, no figures, nothing. Just fog. By the time he reached the 101 interchange, visibility had returned. The road looked normal again. And as his breathing slowed, he tried to rationalize the whole thing. He had been driving for hours. He was exhausted. He had been staring into heavy fog, alone, at night, on an empty road. So he convinced himself he must have hallucinated it. An extremely vivid hallucination, maybe, but still a hallucination. That explanation felt weak, yet it was the only one he had. Then he got home, and when he walked around to the back of the car, the rear bumper was destroyed, crushed inward almost all the way across. The damage was real, which meant something had hit him. But there was no paint transfer, no sign of another vehicle, nothing to explain what had happened on that road. He says that over the years, he has tried to make peace with the idea that maybe he hallucinated the figures and hit a guardrail post while swerving away. But the part he cannot accept is this: if the people weren't real, then what hit his car? The second story happened during spring break, only a few weeks before it was sent in. The narrator was home from college, bored out of his mind, stuck in one of those suburban towns where there's nothing to do and nowhere to go. His hometown friends were either busy or on different schedules, so he decided to spend the week resetting. No drinking, no nicotine, just exercise. One afternoon around 5 o'clock, he went for a run on an old cross-country loop he had used for years. It was a simple 3-mile route. A short stretch through the neighborhood, then a wooded trail, then back out onto the street near his house. He had run that path hundreds of times, maybe more. He knew every turn, every slope, every landmark. That was why he wasn't worried when he noticed the fog. It was thick, abnormally thick, the kind that made everything beyond 30 feet disappear into white haze. He almost skipped the run, but the trail was straightforward. One path, no forks, no confusing turns, so he started anyway. The deeper he got into the woods, the thicker the fog became. The trees cut out the remaining daylight and turned the trail dim and colorless. Still, for the first mile and a half, everything felt normal. He was moving slower than usual, but the path was familiar. Then he checked his watch around what should have been 2.5 miles, and he was still deep in the woods. That didn't make sense. At that point in the run, he should have been approaching the exit. He knew exactly where he should have been. So he assumed his GPS had glitched. Maybe the tree cover was interfering with the signal. Maybe the fog was messing with it. Reasonable explanations. So he kept going. Then the watch passed 3 miles, and he was still in the woods, still on the same dirt trail, still nowhere near the end. That was when he stopped running. He says he isn't a paranoid person, and he isn't superstitious either, but there was no way to explain what was happening. There was only one trail. No side path, no detour, no way he could have wandered off course without noticing. He looked down at his watch again. 3.1 miles. And the number kept climbing, even while he was standing still. That at least confirmed one thing. The GPS was failing. But it didn't explain why the woods were still there. So he made the only decision that made sense. He turned around and started running back the way he had come. By then, the fog had become even worse. He had to slow down just to stay on the trail. And after about a mile of running, he heard something. At first, it sounded distant. Then it grew louder. He describes it as a moan, but says that isn't really accurate. It was lower than a moan, longer, like a droning human sound that rose and fell in uneven waves. Not a cry for help, not an animal, not anything he had ever heard before. Just a wrong sound. A sound that didn't belong in those woods. He started running harder. His legs were already exhausted, but terror gave him one last burst of speed. The sound kept pace with him. No matter how fast he ran, it stayed behind him. Close enough to hear clearly, far enough to remain hidden in the fog. He looked back again and again. Every time, he saw nothing. Only white haze, only empty trail. Only the feeling that something was moving inside it. He says that run felt endless, that his lungs were burning, his legs were failing, and yet the sound behind him never weakened. It just kept following. Then finally, after what felt like far too long, he burst out of the woods and onto the street. He stopped, bent over, nearly throwing up from exhaustion. Then he turned back toward the trail entrance, and there, just beyond the tree line, was a shape. Tall, black, standing dead center on the path. At first he thought it might be a tree, until it swayed, slowly, back and forth. He says it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. A solid dark mass in the fog, watching him. The droning sound had stopped, but somehow that made it worse, because now the thing didn't need sound anymore. Now it was visible. He ran all the way home and never looked back. His parents later tried to explain it away. Maybe it had been some tall person trying to scare him. Maybe someone had followed him through the trail. But he doesn't believe that, because no person could make that sound while keeping pace with him for that long. And no person should have looked like that in the fog. The last story happened years earlier in Washington, on Willapa Bay. The narrator and his friend Edwin had talked for years about kayaking there. Both of them were experienced. They weren't amateurs. They knew the water. They knew how fog worked. They knew how to navigate, which is why what happened still haunts them. They launched early in the morning near Nakota. The fog was thick, but they expected it to burn off by mid-morning. The plan was simple: paddle out, explore a bit, maybe stop for lunch, then return before the tide shifted. For the first hour, everything was fine. The bay was quiet in that unnatural way heavy fog can make the world quiet. Then, around 9, the narrator heard it. A rhythmic splashing. At first, he thought it was Edwin, but Edwin's paddle was resting across his kayak, and Edwin had heard it too. It wasn't the sound of paddles. It was the sound of oars. Someone rowing a boat somewhere nearby in the fog. They called out, No answer. The rowing continued, steady, even, unchanging. So they started paddling again, expecting the other boat to either pass them or appear through the haze. But over the next 20 minutes, something became deeply unsettling. The sound never got closer, never got farther away. It just stayed with them, always off to the side, always matching them. At one point, the fog thinned just enough for the narrator to catch a glimpse of it. A small rowboat, and someone sitting at the oars. Then the fog swallowed it again. That brief glimpse made everything worse, because now they knew the boat was real, and they knew it was somehow following them without ever fully appearing. The narrator wanted to leave. He didn't know why exactly, but every instinct told him something was wrong. So they changed direction and headed toward shore. Still, the sound followed them. Stroke after stroke, measured, patient, like whoever was rowing had no intention of losing them. Then, without warning, the fog began to lift. Not fully, but enough that they could suddenly see much farther across the bay. And when they looked toward where the rowing had been coming from, there was nothing there. No boat, no person, no movement on the water at all. Just empty bay in every direction. By then, relief was gone. Now there was only fear. Because how does a rowboat that close simply vanish? They kept paddling until shore came into view. When they reached the shallows, the narrator jumped out, grateful to finally be standing on solid ground. But that feeling didn't last. Because when Edwin moved up the beach, he found something. Wet, barefoot footprints. Fresh ones, leading out of the water. The prints came up onto the sand near where they had landed, followed the shoreline for a while, then turned and disappeared into the trees. The narrator couldn't stop staring at them. They were fresh, still holding water in the depressions. Whoever had made them had come out of the bay not long before they arrived, and they had come from somewhere farther down the shore. Against Edwin's better judgment, they followed the prints. A few minutes later, they found the boat, a small wooden rowboat pulled onto the sand, dark wood, oars resting inside. The exact same boat the narrator had glimpsed through the fog. He started to move toward it, but Edwin grabbed his arm and told him they were leaving. Not later, not in a minute, now. And suddenly the narrator understood why. Because whoever had been rowing that boat had somehow reached land before them, walked the shoreline, arrived near the exact place where they landed, and then disappeared into the forest. They turned around, ran back to the kayaks, shoved them into the water, and paddled away as fast as they could. Years later, he still cannot explain it. And what disturbs him most is not just that the rowboat followed them through the fog. It's that whoever was in it seemed to know exactly where they were going before they did. Fog has a way of making everything feel uncertain. Roads feel longer. Trails feel endless. Water feels empty. But maybe what makes fog so terrifying isn't what it hides. Maybe it's what it reveals, only when you're already too close. A man standing by a road that should be empty. A sound in the woods that no living thing should be able to make. A rowboat that stays beside you until the moment it vanishes. These people all walked away, but none of them ever really left those moments behind. And maybe that's the worst part. Sometimes the scariest things don't follow you home. They just wait in your memory. Quiet, shapeless, and patient. Waiting for the next foggy night. If this story unsettled you, subscribe to Whispered Horror for more dark tales, eerie encounters, and midnight narrations. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which of these 3 stories disturbed you the most? Until next time, keep the lights low and listen carefully, because in the dark, even a whisper can sound like a warning.